organizations take leadership for granted. There's an assumption that if you've been working for a number of years, or if you have your PhD or your MD, you're going to be a good leader. And people are just thrown into the situation.
I always tell people leadership is hard.
It's not just what we do, the work we're doing, it's how we do it. Trying to be very intentional. What is it you're trying to achieve? How are you bringing everybody else along with you? How are you making sure that, this staff is sharing their ideas, as opposed to just waiting for someone to tell them what to do? Leadership is very contextualized. A woman in India versus a woman in Kenya is quite different. How do we really help ensure that there's more diversity in the who leads, so that there's both women and men at the decision table? How are we also equipping these leaders with these different skills so that they can go in and be truly impactful? We don't have all the answers, right? We're learning as we go. Leadership is always a little lonely on the top. When you're trying to be something else, it's exhausting. You can't be a powerful leader when you're not being yourself.
It is time to reimagine leadership. My name is Ben Owden, and I would like to welcome you to a series of conversations in partnership with Women Lift Health around how can we develop new approaches to the new challenges that leaders face in the 21st century. Greetings to you. I hope you are having a meaningful and productive day and that you are well. Welcome to another episode of the Why Lead podcast. I am your host, Ben Owden. Now, we've been having a series of conversations brought to you by Women Lift Health, and the world is changing. And so leadership has to be reimagined. We can't continue to operate the same way. So how do we reimagine leadership? That is the focus of our conversations. And as the world is becoming increasingly complex and new things are coming up and innovations, now there's the rise of AI. Now we're having conversations around diversity and so many other things. All these new challenges require new approaches to address them, right? And so this series of conversations is centered around how can we reimagine leadership and how can we think of new approaches as we are confronted by these new challenges. And in our conversation today, we'll be talking and exploring the role of inclusive leadership in fostering diverse and equitable workplaces. And to have this conversation, I am joined by a leader who previously served at the World Bank, where she co-led the World Bank support of advanced market commitments. She has served as Chief Strategy Officer and Vice President of Applied Analytics and Learning for PATH, as a Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Global Health Bureau of USAID, leading the agency's engagement in the President's Global Health Initiative. She served on the Gavi board and led the Child Survival Call to Action. She is currently the president of Women Lift Health, an organization dedicated to expanding the power and influence of talented women leaders in global health and catalyzing systemic change to achieve gender equality in leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, Amie Batson. Amie, you're most welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
I think earlier we were talking about leadership, and you said something interesting. You said leadership matters, and not just the what or the who, but the how as well. What do you mean by that?
I think all too often organizations take leadership for granted. There's an assumption that if you've been working for a number of years, or if you have your PhD or your MD, you're going to be a good leader. And people are just thrown into the situation. But in fact, what we see is an intentionality around who are leaders and how the styles of leadership that they bring are really important to the outcomes that you're looking for. So the who is, of course, about diversity. That there's been studies, in fact, that by McKinsey that shows when you have senior leadership teams that have more diversity on them, the ultimate outcome, and in this case it was private sector, so it was profitability. But the outcomes increase, they improve, and it's logical, right? Because you've got a wealth of experiences, of perspectives, so you're getting a fuller picture of what's the real problem here. Right? You're getting a fuller picture of what are possible innovations and the pros and cons and implications of them, as opposed to when you have a group that's all the same. For example, you have all men and they all went to the same schools. You end up with a group think, and they're all like, oh, we're in violent agreement. right? We all know this is the problem, this is the solution. From our perspective in the world, that's it. But of course, when you bring in somebody else who may say, as a woman, have you thought about the fact that, they had this in the car industry, right? All of the safety belts and the security bag, the bags that come
Airbags,
out, airbags, thank you. Well, the airbags that came out, all of them had been tested on dummies that were the size of a man. And they never actually had tested it on a woman who was typically several inches shorter. And they suddenly discovered that they just weren't as effective. In fact, they could kill you. But it was this mindset, right? All of these men engineers, they designed around the typical person, which was a man, and they never even thought beyond that. We saw it in COVID, where you had all male committees making decisions for the population about how to handle sort of the COVID and limit the potential risk of transmission. And so in several countries, in fact, in East Africa in particular, they had curfews at night. And so no one was allowed out of their house or on the streets at night. Of course, none of these all-male panels thought about the fact that women may be delivering babies, and babies often come at night, and you can't schedule them. So how are these women to get to the hospitals? And we even heard reports of these women who were having to go through the streets to get to the hospitals to deliver their babies, and they were being beaten by the police because they were breaking curfew. So it's the what you don't even know you're not seeing, right? Which is that who. You want the diversity. Now, just who is not enough. How you lead, right, is so critically important. And it is really interesting, as you opened with, there is this growing awareness that the nature of the big challenges we're seeing are really changing in the world. They tend to be much more interconnected or, require a number of different disciplines and skills to think about them. They end up evolving much more quickly. And you can think about media and the effect of social media and whatnot in terms of how the information goes out. There tends to be a lot more ambiguity or uncertainty attached to them, in part because of the speed with which they're moving, right? That you don't have all the answers when you're going into it. And you need only think about COVID or climate change and health to realize, right, how this is playing out. And so with that evolving kind of nature of the challenges, what we're seeing from leadership experts around the world is they're saying, what makes the characteristics of a truly impactful leader is also changing. And they're highlighting that, it's being strategic and being decisive, which I think have always been characteristics that have been valued in leadership. But now the leadership experts are also saying it's about being empathetic. It's about being collaborative. It's about being authentic and being able to really communicate with people. These words like collaborative, empathetic, authentic, these were never associated with, the leadership that as a child or young adult, I think any of us were exposed to. And it's certainly not the type of leadership characteristics that is unfortunately rewarded or reinforced in most organizations today, which still tend to look towards a more hierarchical and autocratic kind of top-down. You have the boss, they tell everyone what to do, it's very clear. And, so that nature of what makes for an impactful leader is changing. And so that's a big part of what we're thinking about is how do we really help ensure that there's more diversity in the who leads so that there's both women and men at the decision table? And how are we also equipping these leaders with these different skills so that they can go in and be truly impactful?
Yeah, I agree with what you said there, because there's a class that we have on leadership, and there's always that question: what's the leadership style that I need to apply, right? And I think leadership is heavily contextual, depends on the context that you're in, but there are some transformations and changes that have happened throughout history in the world that are affecting pretty much everyone. And we were talking earlier, and you mentioned, right, that whole strongman type of approach of leadership. And that might have been useful in a hunter-gatherer society where people were constantly attacking each other and killing each other and whatnot. But the world has evolved so much. All these technologies, when the Industrial Revolution happened, it required a different set of leadership skills to organize and to lead in that particular way. When the civil rights movement started happening, people were fighting for independence, and most nations in the world were free. It required a different kind of approach and leadership. And now in the world that we're having and the challenges when we're talking about diversity and equity and inclusion, when we talk about how the world is becoming more open, which means people can work and collaborate across territories and countries, that requires a different set of skills. And I think that sense of constantly evolving and changing for leaders is hard. So for a leader who is stuck in the past, they are in 2024, but they're operating as if they were in the 1400s. What sort of questions do they need to ask themselves to unlock that journey of unlearning? Because I think unlearning sometimes is very hard because there's a sense of loss. You're parting ways with a way of thinking, a way of operating that has become the norm and the standard for you. But it is irrelevant. It is getting in the way of your own success and the success of those that you're responsible for. So what are the questions that leaders need to ask themselves to sort of transition into where the world is heading?
I mean, it's a really tough question because, as you say, you've gotten to your level of leadership because your style was successful, and then suddenly you're being asked to change and evolve, and that's a very scary thing because of the fear of failure. Like you're trying some new style. What if it doesn't work? I mean, I'll be honest. I think there's some that are stuck in the past that I don't think there's any question you could ask them that would unlock would unlock it. Right? They're so kind of deeply immersed in their style as being right. I think for leaders that are a little more open, having some conversations around, first of all, what is it you're trying to achieve? Like reconnecting them back to their purpose, and so not just like it's not about. They're not always connected to, I have to lead like this. No, they're connected to the goal of their organization, right? So reconnecting them back to that goal and trying then, once they're connected to their goal, to ask some questions about, well, if that's your goal, how are you bringing everybody else along with you? How are you making sure that, this staff is sharing their ideas as opposed to just waiting for someone to tell them what to do? And making it part of their own sort of sense of legacy, right, and pride in what they're leaving in their organization, I think is one way for opening it up, right? Opening up some of that question. I think the other is often exposing them to something different that's disruptive, exposing them to sort of some new idea or some different perspective. And in fact, in one of our sessions this morning, one of the speakers, Rohini Anand, who's done a tremendous amount of work of change management work in corporations, was telling a story about a CEO that she had worked with of a very large organization that had all the data showing, the issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and the problems of sort of some of the women advancing in leadership, and he just didn't believe the data, right? The data wasn't what his own experience was, so he ignored the data. And so somehow she had gotten him to agree to be part of a cross-organizational kind of mentor-mentee program. And he was paired up with this woman leader, right, from another organization. And so he got to know her very well. And, she would come and talk about some of the challenges that she was facing in the organization that were clearly the result of bias, right? That was clearly coming because she was a woman. And, how she was being treated, what would happen in certain meetings, some of the political plays. And ultimately, apparently, this woman even, she lost her job. And for the CEO who knew this woman and knew how competent she was, right, to suddenly be personally exposed to what her experience as a woman leader changed his mind, right? Suddenly made him wake up and say, I can't believe this is actually happening in organizations today. And I do not want this happening in my organization. And so as a result of his being exposed to something that had personal meaning to him, he then became the sponsor in the institution about some really important changes that promoted, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and sort of in particular for women.
So I guess there we see the value of experience, right? And to experience and to walk in a world that is not of your own and to see everything through. And I think that's empathy, really, to be able to see something through the eyes of someone else.
Yeah.
Now, something else that, you've mentioned as well is authenticity. And
I've heard it said, and there was a time I think I believed it, right? This idea that people say, there's this advice, be yourself. But most people who say be yourself don't really want to see your true self. It's a nice thing to say, but they're not ready to see your true self. And I think as the world is changing, we see conversations around being vulnerable and authenticity, it's an idea that's built around this idea of being vulnerable and the courage required to do that. So when we talk about all of these things, I think I've come to learn that it's much easier for men to be authentic. It's much more acceptable, as a matter of fact,
Yes,
for men
exactly.
to be authentic. But then for women, it's much harder. And I've had conversations with several leaders who are women, and it's like people like the idea, but they don't like the reality of it. And there's an aspect of microaggression around women leaders when they are authentic. So it's this unspoken, but there's a microaggression that maybe as a man, I would not be able to know what it is, but that's there, that the sense of judgment and around your authenticity. And so as a result, it's much harder for women to be authentic, to be their true selves, and even when they're hold positions of leadership. And so how can women leaders find the courage required to be authentic, to be vulnerable, to be themselves? And I think especially when they hold positions of leadership, because then you're a reference point, you're an example for those who are maybe on their way up.
Yeah.
So how do they find that courage?
Yeah, no, it really is an issue. And, for women, like from, when you're, 2 feet high, you're already being told, don't be so loud, don't be so soft, don't laugh so much, don't wear so much makeup, don't do this, don't do that. And you're never enough. You're always being told to be something else. And so, in our program with Women Lift Health, we have, the women are coming as mid-career experts. So they have all of their degrees, and they've been in the health workforce for 10 to 20 years, and in these sort of middle management to sort of early senior management roles. And the first phase of our program is about authentic leadership. And it's really about these women having an opportunity to stop, be in a safe space, right, where nobody's judging them. And sort of first start reconnecting with their purpose, which, 20 years into your career, sometimes you've forgotten because you're so battered. But second, it's for them to start to be able to say, this is who I am, and be surrounded by other women in the cohort, by their coaches and mentors, and with the response not of, oh, that's terrible, you can't do that, but rather, that's wonderful. We love that about you. And it can be, as simple as, like, I've literally had a woman who's from Africa, who's working in the United States, and she was saying how she's was wearing like always black or gray. She had her hair up in a bun, and yet she loved colors, and she'd like to have her hair free and wild, and but she'd always been told she couldn't do that. And the problem is, when you're like trying to be something else, it's exhausting.
It is.
Right? You're playing a role. It's exhausting. And you can't be a powerful leader when you're not being yourself. You're spending too much of your energy and attention playing a role. So for these women to suddenly be like, hey, it's okay that this is who I am and I can do this. I am enough, and the fact that I like to wear colors is just fine, and I'm going to go into my workplace and do it. The fact that I want to wear my hair loose and not in a tight bun, it's okay. So for the women, I think it's actually having that moment to pause and reconnect and realize like how they've been, pushed into some role that maybe they don't want to take anymore. To have that reinforced by people around them, to say, no, we love who you are. And to then be able to say, okay, how does that play out in my professional environment? And what pieces of that am I comfortable and do I feel safe bringing? And, the reality is for some women and in some environments, they're not safe being fully authentic. And that's a sort of a intentional decision that they need to be in charge of and making. And so, one of the conversations we have is you decide, right? It's your professional environment. It's you. We know who you are. You're loved for who you are. You're respected for who you are. And you should take these elements into your workplace as much as it's safe for you to do so, right? And I think it's that gives the women that courage to say, yeah, some of these things I can take. There may be elements that I really don't want to expose in the workplace, but it's made a huge difference. And we've heard from so many women that now they're feeling they can show up being authentic, and they're willing to take the risk of being more vulnerable and sharing more about themselves.
The example that you've used of this woman, right, in terms of how she shows up in the workplace, I think some of it may be influenced by some cultural, maybe whatever happens in their community or their society. But I think sometimes it's institutional bias, right? When I think even this happens a lot when people go for job interviews. I see it myself when I'm going for an interview, be it a visa interview or any. You present yourself in a way that you think is acceptable to the other side. You feel like, what version of me would they want to see, right? Where you it's not natural to think, I'm just going to go there as myself. You want to see present a certain. So sometimes it's maybe institutional bias that people have. And so how do we get to a place where deeply ingrained cultural bias, institutional bias, especially I guess when it comes to things like inclusion and diversity, how can organizations begin, so to speak, to get to a point where they go beyond the superficial ideas around diversity? Because now you see, even quotas, as a matter of fact, some people having quotas can be a very superficial thing. Let's just get 3 women in this room, but they don't really have agency to actually make meaningful change, to contribute. You're just there. You have a seat on the table. So it's a form of tokenism, so to speak. So how do we rise above the superficial idea of diversity, but get to a place of real inclusion, a place of where there's actual equity and agency for those who are in the room?
Yeah. Building trust is, I think, at the heart of it. That, you can say anything you want and you can pull together whatever group you want. But if people don't truly trust that it's a safe space, it doesn't matter, right? And building trust is hard. And it's built on thousands of little behaviors every day. And it's very much built also on the leader of the organization and their behavior. So, you see the organization where the leader says, we believe in, every person should be treated with respect. And then they have one of the, the direct report to this person, the CEO who's just said that, turns around and does something highly disrespectful to somebody. And the CEO says, oh, well, that's just Ben, he's an old boy and, but he's great at sales. So we're going to let it go. Right. Or he's great at, whatever he does, we're just going to let it go. And as soon as that happens, that's it. Your trust is gone because you're saying one thing, you're saying you're calling for it, and yet you're reinforcing the negative behavior rather than correcting it. And so I think that for organizations to create a space where there's truly a sense of people willing to share who they are, it requires from the very top, a level of honesty, a level of willing to be vulnerable themselves and model the behavior, and a willingness to reinforce and both reward and call out when, the next level of leadership and the next level beyond that isn't following the guidance, isn't following what's being sought out. Because people see a lie immediately as soon as you allow bad behavior to happen.
Yeah. And a lot of it, I think, leadership is, I always tell people leadership is hard. Because a lot of the work happens internally. You constantly have to create space to introspect, to create space to evolve as an individual.
Yeah.
Especially as the world becomes more open, as we become more diverse, and not, as you said earlier, it's not just about maybe gender, but it's about sometimes diversity of thought, having people who think differently than you do. And all of it requires to constantly look in the mirror and see what needs to improve, what needs to change, so that you can continue to be more effective in the workplace. Now, I love the tagline, new approaches for new challenges, right? And as the leader of Women Lift Health, from where it came from to where it is, and I'm sure the vision is to do a lot more. So 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 100 years from now, right? If we're to look into the future, we talk about adaptability, we talk about change, we talk about always evolving as a core part of leadership, always changing and adapting, and being agile and all of those things. But I think if we're to look into the future, let's go to 100 years from now. What aspects of what makes Women Lift Health work would you like to keep 100 years into the future? A lot might change, but what are some of the key things that you say, you know what, if these things remain, we'll continue to have effect in this pursuit of advancing women leadership in healthcare?
Yeah, we're a very value-based organization. In fact, what we often say, it's not just what we do, right? The work we're doing, it's how we do it as an organization. And so we're trying to be very intentional. And I think some of the key elements of our culture that I believe are so important, one is that it is a respectful environment that celebrates diversity, right? It's one where, we have a very decentralized, because leadership is very contextualized, right? And so we have a very sort of decentralized power structure so that within each region, the team is sort of setting the context and able to have that flexibility to be bringing in, the sort of leadership contextualization that makes the type of work we do relevant and, meaningful for the women we're working with. Because, human leadership skills, right, are universal, but how that's, the language that's used, the stories that are used, the people, the coaches and mentors and stuff so a woman in India versus a woman in Kenya is quite different, right? So a big part of it is building into how we work that respect and that celebration of our diversity. And another is very much about being a truly learning environment that requires humbleness, right? So we often say, we don't have all the answers, right? We're learning as we go. We're constantly making sure that we're listening. Listening is particularly to the women leaders we work with, and adapting. And it's okay if we got it wrong, right? That's important information, and we can evolve and make it better. But making sure that the entire team brings this learning mindset and the humility and humbleness behind it, I think is also a really kind of critical thing that I would want to see 100 years from now. I think a third piece is we have established a very collaborative leadership model. So, I am the president, but I've watched so many presidents who sort of sit all by themselves and think they have to have all the answers. And, of course they don't. But when they take that attitude, they make decisions, whether they know or not, and often they're not very good. And it's, leadership is always a little lonely on the top, and that's true for me too. But much less so because, we have the senior leadership team, and we really, I'll raise a question, such and such is happening. Now here's, let's discuss what are the different perspectives on it and the pros and the cons, and let's have a whole discussion. So we've really put on the table everyone's their voices and their views. And there's sometimes where I've come into it with one idea, and after listening, we're all like, oh yeah, that's definitely the way we're going to go, right? We all agree that makes total sense. And so that collaborative model yields much better results, is make sure everybody is as engaged, right, and owning, the work that we do. And, it just ensures that we're being truly relevant around the world and not just having it dominated by one person's perspective. And so that kind of model is something that I would also really want to see kind of continuing.
Well, I like that. Decentralized, always learning, and collaborative. I think, definitely. I can see how those would be ingredients that can keep any organization really, always evolving, always adapting. Doesn't matter what will be happening in the world. If you're always collaborating, it means you're always able to respond to some of the things that are happening. And as you continue to grow and you maintain that sense of being decentralized as well, it means different groups and different contexts will continue to be served in the way that they should be served, right? Rather than having this one approach that maybe sometimes doesn't translate well in other contexts.
Exactly.
So beautifully said. Now, as we're coming to the end of our conversation, I would like to bring up this question that we ask pretty much all of our guests, the 111. What is the one book that you've read at some point in your life that you say, if there was a time machine and I could go back 10, 20 years ago, I would take this book with me? And what is the one habit that maybe you developed later in life that you say, I wish I'd started doing this or practicing this earlier as well? And then what is the one personal value that you will not compromise no matter the cost?
So the book, there's, of course, many, but one that came immediately to mind was a book called Designing Your Life. And it's by these, I should have looked up the authors, but by these two Stanford professors who raised the issue, we do a lot of design thinking when it comes to a technology, right, or a product. But when it comes to your life, people don't apply any kind of logic or design to sort of huge decisions in your life. And so I read this book at a really seminal moment where I had, just left my company. The company I was with, the INGO, had downsized. And, for the first time in my life, I was let go. That had never happened to me, in my career. And it was a real shocker. And I was taking time to just, reflect and think about what did I want to do next and not just jumping into the next job. And so I read this book at that moment, and it made me step back and think very differently about how I wanted to think about a career. And that I didn't just have to keep doing what I was being successful in and doing, to date. And being able to be open and exploring ideas ultimately is why I'm at Women Lift Health. One of the major points this book made was, you should never just make a decision in a dark closet, right? Go get a little more data, get your toes wet if you have the luxury of being able to do it. And so, when Women Lift Health, pre-Women Lift Health, when it was just a conference, and some, the dean at Stanford, Michelle Berry, asked me to come in and do this work. I was like, I've never done work like this before, but I just said, the book, right? And so I said, I'll tell you what, I'll do some pro bono work. That way I can get my feet wet, see what it is, if, design it to be what I want it to be, if I were to take it, et cetera. And so, I did that. And then I was like, okay, I'm enjoying this. I'm going to work more. Okay, you can start paying me as a consultant, right? And then, hey, I need to supervise people, so you can hire me now, Yeah. But it was only because my brain was working differently thanks to that book. So Designing Your Life, that was a really seminal book. Habit, I think it's being more relaxed as a leader to step back and admit you don't always know the answer, right? And feeling comfortable to do that. I think early on in leadership, you sometimes feel such pressure that if you don't know the answer,
have the answers,
people will know you're an imposter, right? And then you suddenly, you reach a different point. You're like, hey, it's okay. Nobody has all the answers. So admitting, when you just don't know and you're open to it. And then I think a value. I think it's integrity. I think it's doing what you know is right, doing something you know has meaning, and being true to that.
I love that. I think I will have to check out the book, and I would have to read the book, because I remember some of the most impactful advice I ever got was around the time when I was getting married, and somebody told my wife and I, design your own marriage, and I extended that into my own life, design your own life, and it's something that whenever sometimes people question my decisions and the choices that I make, I realize, no, you are designing your own life. It doesn't have to look like what other people are doing. So I particularly love that. And then, of course, not taking yourself too seriously, I guess, is another one. And something that I always reinforce even within my own team is that leadership is more about asking the right questions than it is about providing answers. And when you get to that point, when you truly believe that, it takes so much pressure off of you. And at the same time, you become more open to collaboration. You guys have the answers. Yeah. And can I ask the right questions to create and spark that creativity and thinking around the room and space? So thank you for sharing all of that. And we've come to the end of our conversation. But thank you so much, Amie, for all the insights that you have shared. You've inspired me. You've made me think, and you've challenged me as well. So thank you for making the time to have this conversation.
Likewise. Thank you so very much.
Yeah, and to our dear listener, and for those who are watching, this is the Why Lead Others podcast, and I'm your host, Ben Owden. Thank you.